You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. It's another off-season week. It's slow. There's not much happening, right? Nah, there's always something happening. The off-season's kind of where all the drama comes, and that's the best part. So we've got some conversations to have about that. Today's episode, we're going to do a brief chat about the Big 12 spring meetings that are taking place this week. We'll do a quick Brendan Sorsby update, the Texas Tech quarterback. We'll do a little look at the official visits, a real brief one. We're not going to dive into it. And then we're going to continue our schedule series today with Utah's next two opponents in football. So we'll dive into that. Now, before we do that, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Feeling confident about your finances changes everything. And that's where Canyon View Credit Union comes in. They focus on helping you build something strong over time at your pace and in a way that fits your life. With Canyon View Credit Union, it's not about one-size-fits-all solutions. It's about steady progress, real guidance, and having someone in your corner who's there for the long run. Through every step, every goal, every new chapter, Canyon View Credit Union is right there with you. And honestly, that kind of support just feels different. Learn more about how Canyon View Credit Union can help you build your own momentum at canyonviewcu.com. Canyon View Credit Union, shaping your financial journey. All right, let's jump into this. It's, I didn't promise. Last week, I said I may split these episodes up into two, but with the holiday this week and some other things that are going on, I decided to combine the two opponents. So I apologize for that if you are looking for two. So you can split these up. You can do whatever you want with it. I won't be mad about that. But we're going to do both opponents this week in one episode. And then maybe next week we'll try to get separate ones. It just depends on my schedule and what's going on. Now that my kids are out of school, that does change things a little bit because, terrorists, teenagers, they're fun. Now they're great. So let's dive into some little off-season talk. This week is the Big 12 spring meetings. They're going to be hosted in Frisco, Texas, back in Texas for another year. And during these meetings, this isn't just for football. This is for basketball, football, other sports, that kind of stuff. Primarily for basketball and football. But this is an opportunity for coaches, athletic directors, the commissioner to be able to come together and talk about a lot of the issues that are facing collegiate sports right now. Every conference has theirs. Last week, the ACC did theirs. The SEC has been doing theirs this week. So there's a lot of conversations being had around college football about what the direction is that everybody wants to be moving, right? There's obviously a lot of changes in the sport. There's not a lot of consistency in a lot of respects. And so there's just a lot of conversations being had about what can be done. And so this week, the Big 12 will have their chance to do that. Later on this week, we will get an opportunity to hear from the commissioner. We'll get to hear from a select few for football and basketball. And get to see that. My colleague Mitch Harper is down in Texas right now. He's covering this down there, but there will be some Zoom meetings that we're able to participate in and kind of get some ideas of what's going on there. So I'll try to update you next week if there's anything earth-shattering. I can't imagine there being anything earth-shattering, but with the nature of college football and collegiate sports in general, there's always something, right? And so there's always something that's going to be a conversation. One of the biggest conversations this offseason is the decision to potentially move to expanding the college football playoffs from 12 to 24. You're essentially doubling that. If you remember last year, there was all these models about how you could do it, which conferences got the most, do they have automatic qualifiers, what's taking place in that way. If you may remember last year, Brett Yormark in the spring meetings, as well as in the Big 12 media days in July, he said he wanted equal access to all the teams in the country. Basically, he wants them to earn it. They still want the automatic bid from the conference, so he supported the 5+11 model. 5 automatic qualifiers like you're used to, plus 11, getting to 16, right? That was kind of the trajectory that everybody was kind of moving, that 16 was going to be the model that everybody wanted last year. Moving from 12 to 16, doing these incremental steps, but it always felt like there was a bigger step here. And the Big 10 has been the one leading the charge in terms of wanting to expand this all the way to 24. They want more access for their teams. Obviously, the Power 2 conferences have the lion's share of the power, if not a majority of that power, simply based on some agreements that were signed. I've done episodes on this last summer. If you're really desperate for understanding on that, you can go back to those episodes, and I try to document pretty well what took place to allow those two conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, to take control of basically the college football playoffs. And so what's going on right now is just kind of trying to figure out a path forward, right? If all of these conference commissioners can create a path forward for an expanded playoff, whether that be 16 or 24, that's going to change. And actually going into this year, this is the last year that they technically have the agreement for 12. They have to come to an agreement here soon on what they need to do. So this season, off season, is going to be pivotal in what they're going to try to do to expand. There's going to be expansion. You know, that's something that's going to be a guarantee and a given. But the question is, how is it going to be? Is it 16? Is it 24? The Big 10 has no interest in going to 16. They don't even want to entertain offers. And if that's one of those things that these other conferences, want to try to get to the table and have that conversation, the Big 10 right now is standing firm and they don't want to move. And so there's interesting talks there in terms of what's going to happen. I think you're going to see a consensus around 24 teams. We'll see what the Big 12 stance is on that. They obviously want equal access, right? Meaning auto qualifiers. So if that means each of the Power 4 conferences get, 4 teams or whatever it may be, that's what he wants. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, quite honestly. I don't think the Big 12 has enough power to be able to negotiate a deal like that. I think you're going to find a scenario where the Power 2 gets a lopsided share of the automatic qualifiers, if there is that scenario, right? You're going to have potentially the Big 10, and the SEC, let's say, get 4 automatic qualifiers, the Big 12 and the ACC getting 2, and then a group of 6 program getting 1 bid or whatever have you. Maybe the Big 12 and ACC can negotiate for 3. Whatever it is, the Power 2 is most likely going to have the lion's share of these bids. And I've run through the numbers. We've showed it. They deserve it in a lot of respects. But at the same time, cementing yourself to a legacy like that makes it tough, because now you're only continually adding to that divide. That divide's growing regardless of that. But the more you kind of cement that and codify that, so to speak, that makes it tougher for programs in the Big 12, the ACC, the group of 6 to be able to catch up, right? And so you slowly start to see that separate even more. And you're already getting that on a year-to-year basis. But anything that you can put into writing that codifies it, that makes it a challenge. So that's the plan of what's going to be. The Big 10 wants to get that 24 model. I think you're going to start seeing more people come around to that, simply because that's where everybody's headed. It's more access. Essentially, you're taking the top 25 teams, right? Maybe that brings a little bit more validity and opportunity for people in the top 25. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. But we will hear this week on what Yormark, the athletic directors, the coaches have to say about that. So that's something to take into consideration. A couple other things are the College Sports Commission enforcement. This is the enforcement arm of NIL, essentially. So all of these deals that are going on through NIL, they have to go through the CSC. The problem is there hasn't been a signed university participation agreement, meaning there hasn't been one document that all conferences can agree to basically enforce and allow the CSC to do their job. And so as it stands, they're doing their job right now. They're putting stuff out there. There's a case with Nebraska that's going through it, that the CSC has put it out there. There's some other schools out there, but there's no real enforcement or weight behind it. And then so there's going to be conversations around that, how to get there. What can you do? Is there a ballot option, or does this really have to come down to congressional intervention to be able to make this work? That remains to be seen. That's boring. Nobody cares. Lastly, there's obviously going to be the private capital deal that was recently signed by the Big 12, giving teams essentially a loan. This isn't full private equity in the sense that like you're taking a share of the programs, similar to kind of how Utah's doing it right now with their PE deal. No, that has not been signed yet. It's still getting close. These things take a lot of time, and you want to make sure that they are fully vetted and everything is worked out before you sign it. So there's no rush to this. The plan, would hopefully be by July 1st to get into that new fiscal year. But, it's been pretty silent in terms of the progression of what that is. And so still TBD. So regardless of that, this is a separate one for the Big 12, but this is more essentially a loan. Schools can participate in this. They're not guaranteed or required to do this. They are allowed to just get an infusion of cash essentially to be able to support what they need. With that said, you are paying that back. And I'm sure, it's not going to be an easy situation by all that has been reported. And admittedly, I'm not a source to come to for this private capital deal. That's just not my forte. This is not one that is getting universal support from the league, not meaning that they don't support it, but more that they don't want to utilize it, right? It's a payday loan, right? In a lot of respects. Maybe it's not quite that bad, but at the same time, it's trying to get an infusion of cash to try to make sure that you can make ends meet as a program. But somebody's going to come calling, and that becomes a challenge. So you'll hear conversations about that. Honestly, the biggest news coming from this week is most likely going to be around the 2014 playoffs, if that is possible. What's at stake? All the different mechanics to be able to go into that, NIL, enforcement of that, those types of things are probably going to be the biggest topics of conversation here at the Big 12 spring meeting. So, something to look at. Nothing really more to go into that until there is news, and then we'll bring that to you when that happens. Quick update on Brennan Sorsby, just because this is I said that really weird, integral to the Big 12. And that is, his gambling case, the eligibility situation for this quarterback at Texas Tech. What happens there? He recently just finished his rehab for gambling. He claims that he is in a much better place right now. I'm not saying that in a pejorative way. It's just he says that he's in a better spot right now, and you hope for his sake that there really is some scenario where he is in a good spot. But at the same time, the NCAA denied his eligibility for this upcoming season. They essentially just said, "You're done. You're not able to do that," and so there's some trouble for him. Now he's going to appeal the ruling. I can't imagine the NCAA does anything to change that. Eligibility rules related to gambling, you kind of have to draw a hard line, and they have drawn a hard line in a lot of other cases, especially basketball. So you can't really just let this go with a quote unquote star quarterback. Texas Tech obviously is trying to fight like crazy to be able to make sure that he can play. They claim that they have reasons that would allow him to be able to get his eligibility. You can always find a reason for anything. They were already claiming team camaraderie and trying to be able to gamble helps, but that's a massively slippery slope if you allow that to pass, because then anybody's going to gamble and say that they were trying to build team camaraderie or whatever have you, and that's not going to make it worth it. So Brennan Sorsby, for all intents and purposes, is done in his collegiate career. The NFL supplemental draft is at the end of June. However, right before I went on this episode, Pat McAfee, it was on his show. I trying to remember who said it, but basically says that there is no market for Brennan Sorsby in the NFL. I would assume that's because of the gambling, but at the same time, you go from a player that a lot of people last year going into Cincinnati when he was there were talking about him as being a potential, quarterback in the NFL, to potentially having to quickly jump into there in the NFL supplemental draft and maybe not even making it that way. Now, granted, there's probably a team out there. I mean, if Deshaun Watson can still play in the league, there's room for a lot of people, but for whatever reason, sexual assault can be overcome, and yet somehow gambling can't. So no rhyme or reason to a lot of these things. I don't make the rules. It is what it is. So you can kind of see what happens with him. But for all intents and purposes, barring the NCAA, having the appeal, work in Texas Tech's favor, this isn't a situation where Texas Tech has their star quarterback anymore. And so now they're going to be looking at, their options. And, I'll show the graphic here shortly as we get into the schedule, just as a reminder of the Big 12 odds. Texas Tech is off the board right now. Nobody in the sports books world is predicting them, simply because it's unknown. You have no idea what is going to happen for this Texas Tech team. Clearly, they have a ton of talent beyond a quarterback, but I think when you have a massive drop, and it's not a massive drop off because the talent isn't there. It's a massive drop off because your next best talent is coming off of an ACL injury, and there's no guarantee. And so there's a lot of variations on what this Texas Tech team can be, simply based on that quarterback position. So quick update there. Lastly, before we jump into the schedule and looking into all that kind of stuff, is this week is a big week for Utah in their official visit calendar, right? This is the week where recruits start coming on the campus of the University of Utah and taking part in their official visit. I think there's 10 or so this week. I forgot to get the main number. I didn't get the main number simply because I wasn't going to go crazy on that today. But this is a big weekend, a lot of big names coming in. This is where Utah is going to try to put its best foot forward. Really curious to see how Morgan Scalley and his coaching staff manages this, what they do, what they prioritize, how many people they bring in, what is kind of going on that way. So, if you follow Utah recruiting, a lot of the times it starts out slow and then they get this big influx of talent. With that said, we've got to see the type of players that Scally brings in, right? Last year they got a 5-star commit, and so that helped with Kelvin Obot. But what's this year going to look like? Who are the names that are going to be there? And we'll get into this after this first official visit. I'm going to try to bring in a guest to be able to help explain a lot of these things in the recruiting world and kind of what to look for. But this week, for the next month-ish, begins a very busy schedule for Utah athletics, Utah football, I should say more specifically, on trying to host a lot of these recruits and trying to get them to commit to Utah. So be paying attention. I'll try to retweet a lot of the different things, a lot of recruits coming in, kind of try to get you some news that way. But for the most part, this is going to be a wait and see type situation. There's a lot of people that are going to be coming in and out. A lot of people that will love Utah and think it's a great situation, but still commit elsewhere. There's other people that are committed to other programs that will come to Utah and then flip. So that's just the nature of recruiting. As a side note to this, high school recruiting is just now a part of the equation, right? Some schools are going to go pretty heavy still in high school recruiting and going a little less in the transfer portal. There's going to be a balance here, and this is where we're going to see how Scally manages it. As we've seen in college football, you do have to kind of get that fresh, homegrown talent to come through, and you've got to develop them. That helps, but we'd be all blind to not acknowledge that getting into the transfer portal, getting players to come in, getting the right players, I should say, helps a program far quicker than going through the freshman ranks and kind of going that way. So there's going to be a balancing act. Kyle Whittingham at the end of his tenure at Utah had a pretty decent balance there. We'll see how Scally sways or moves. I assume he's probably going to be pretty similar, but we'll see how that goes. So just pay attention to all that kind of stuff. All right, before we jump into the schedules, Athlon Magazine released their magazine, their preseason magazine that lists all that. And this one's always interesting because they do the anonymous quote from a Big 12 staffer, right? Not really sure who it is. It could be a coach, it could be, an offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, could be the equipment staff. We honestly have no idea. It's really hard to know who those are. Only people at Athlon Magazine know. But it's an interesting look nonetheless at somebody outside the program and how they view the program that you support, right? And in this case, it's obviously Utah. And so I'm going to read what an opposing, we're assuming coach or somebody said about Utah. And it says, quote, "I'm really curious what it looks like without Kyle Whittingham. They cause a lot of mismatches because they're +1 in the run game with the quarterback and all the pullers and gap schemes that they did. It's going to be really interesting to see what their new philosophy is on offense and defense because they did struggle to stop the run last season. I think they were the worst in the Big 12 against the run last year. That's not them. They've always been great up front, so that'll be interesting. But yeah, it's definitely a relief that Whittingham is out of the Big 12 because he's a great football coach and he's an even better person." you're going to hear a lot of Kyle Whittingham this year. And if you're frustrated with how the whole situation went down, you're still going to hear a lot about Kyle Whittingham. And I guarantee you, when you go into Big 12 media days, the conversation is going to be largely tied to Morgan Scalley and Kyle Whittingham. So if you're tired of that, get used to it, buckle up. Whether you're watching on TV broadcast this fall, you're going to hear about Kyle Whittingham a lot and what he's doing at Michigan and how he left a legacy at Utah. Get used to it, right? But anything that's tied to Morgan Scalley right now is going to be tied to Kyle Whittingham, simply because you're replacing a legendary head coach who was here for 20 plus years, and now you're moving on in another direction. It's natural. That's what it's going to be. So there's not going to be a lot of conversations necessarily about Scalley specifically right now, especially with how everything went down. But there's reasons that this can be beneficial for Utah, because you can kind of catch people sleeping, because they may be looking at Utah as kind of, they can't do what Kyle Whittingham did. And there's nothing to guarantee that Morgan Scalley will, but I think that's going to be this conversation. So that doesn't surprise me that this is the conversation about from an opposing Big 12 member, we'll call it. And there's valid points in there. They were terrible against the run last year, especially late in the season. They need to improve that. That's something that Morgan Scalley took to heart. It drove him crazy as a guy that takes a lot of pride in what he does, and having had a strong, stout defensive line and good against the run, that really pains him to see. So that's going to be an emphasis of focus, or focus of whatever, you know what I'm saying, an emphasis focus of, yeah, whatever. Oh my gosh, words are hard, and it's a good thing I write for a living, huh? Yeah, we don't talk. We don't talk. Anyways, that's gonna be it. It's gonna be what people talk about. That's gonna be what the conversation is, and not too surprising. So that's kind of the background. That's the context to what's going on as Utah faces these teams. But let's dive into the schedule. So I keep saying before we do that, this is more just a reminder. This is the Big 12 odds. This is what's going on from Bovada. As I mentioned, Texas Tech is off the board. So if you didn't see this in the last episode, I'm just bringing this up to be able to remind you of kind of where this is at. So Utah comes into the season with, right now, tied for the best odds in the Big 12, according to Bovada. It's going to be similar to a lot of sports books and kind of how it's looking, 8.5 wins. That's just the nature of what it is. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about Utah State and Iowa State. So Utah State obviously is going to be the last game of the non-conference. I'll talk about them here shortly and what their odds are and kind of where they fit into this new world of the Pac-12. And then Iowa State, you're seeing in here with 5.5 wins. Bovada says Colorado will be the worst team, but many predictors have Iowa State as the worst team coming into the season. And we'll talk about why that's the case. So let's do that. But first, let's go into Utah State. So Utah State, obviously in-state opponent. Many people know this program inside and out. Even if you're, a diehard Utah fan, maybe you have some working knowledge of what Utah State's doing. And so, this is not unfamiliar territory. Obviously, these programs have played many times over the years, fewer over the last few years, but they do have a renewed series schedule between the two programs where they will be playing, if I'm not mistaken, 4 times over the next umpteenth years. But good opportunity for these two programs to be able to face off. The last time Utah played, Utah State was up in Logan, and Utah came away with a 38-21 win. We call this the Isaac Wilson game. This is the game where he kind of got his first moment or first taste of D1 football in a true starter capacity. And, it started out slow. Things weren't going well. Bryson Barnes, Utah's former quarterback, absolutely diced up Utah in that first half and was really controlling the momentum of that game. And then, things flipped, right? Utah got the things that they needed to and were able to kind of make it work. But it wasn't pretty. But at the same time, you kind of took that with a grain of salt in some respects, because it was Isaac Wilson's first true start, and he got his opportunities to do what he did and ended up getting them to a victory. And there were some throws there that Isaac Wilson made that, were pretty encouraging for a lot of people and, exciting, but obviously things didn't pan out that season. It was a terrible season and just it was one of those that left everybody down and ready to be done. So that's the last season that these two teams played. Utah State comes into Rice-Eccles Stadium this year on September 19th. We don't know a time for that. We'll see what happens there, but you get them at home this year. The Aggies finished last season with a 6-7 record, 4-4 in the Mountain West, their last season in the Mountain West, and had an overall solid season. There was a potential where they could get into the Mountain West championship game. There was opportunities there available to them. It just didn't really work out in the way that it needed to, and they faltered and went 500 in Mountain West play. So, there's a good roster there. Bronco Mendenhall, obviously a good, solid coach who's well versed in everything, and is really kind of helping that roster grow. A lot of what you see from Utah State last year, a lot of that is coming back to some extent. There are a lot of key pieces that have departed, but at the same time, a pretty solid base of a roster and moving into this. So for the preseason projections, Utah State is projected to win 4.5 games. They do enter into the Pac-12, this newfound Pac-12 that is there. It's only an 8-team conference right now. And so there's going to be some, moving around and shifting for this team. Curious to see what this brings. You're primarily bringing over a majority of Mountain West teams. And so the competition, I would say, is going to stay relatively the same. You do obviously have Washington State and Oregon State, and you have some other teams that have come in. But for the most part, this is still kind of Mountain West-esque with maybe a little bit of an upgrade in how they do things. So really fascinated to see how this takes place for the Pac-12 for Utah State. Outside of this game, I think many want Utah State to do well. It's good for the state of Utah, right? I think anytime you have an in-state program do well, Utah fans obviously don't want BYU to do well, so there's that. But I don't think there's as much animosity toward Utah and Utah State outside of the Chucky Keaton game and when quarterbacks are getting injured. So outside of that, there's not that. Either way, the Aggies are picked to finish 5th in the Pac-12 this year. So 5th out of 8 teams. So bottom half of the league, but there's reasons to believe that this team could be solid. It just depends, right? It's going to be an interesting situation. The offense was good enough, but the defense kind of let things, slip a little bit. They had a young offensive line that wasn't really working well for them, so they had to manufacture a lot of different things to kind of help Bryson Barnes work. For all the strengths that, or the weaknesses that Bryson Barnes had, he had a ton of strengths as well. And they were able to maximize those strengths at Utah State under Kevin McGivern, who you may remember is now Utah's offensive coordinator. So a lot of what you saw at Utah State in terms of schemes and everything is what Utah is going to be running this year. So there's going to be a lot of familiarity there. I'm curious to see how that works in Utah State's advantage, knowing that Bronco Mendenhall and Kevin McGivern worked together last year. What does that present? This is the 3rd game of the season. You're coming off of that Arkansas game. If that went south for Utah or it was a really tough win, let's say, this game can be even more difficult, right? I still think Utah has a clear advantage in this game. They should have the clear advantage of this game. But this is one of those type of scenarios where things can snowball pretty quickly. And if things didn't go well in that Arkansas game and you're kind of frustrated with how they went, this either can serve as a bounce back game or this can serve as the snowball game, right? Where now Arkansas beats you twice or, whatever the case may be. This game can be a tough game, right? And there's enough experience from Bronco Mendenhall that he knows what to do to be able to make this tough on Utah. He knows Utah probably as well as anybody, just simply from all the years that he played or competed against Utah in his time at BYU. So really fascinating look here on what they're able to do. There's a lot of experience on both of these sides, and we'll see what happens. So there is that. Utah State comes into this game having played Washington the week prior at Washington. So 2 road games against power conference teams, one against the Big 10, one in the Big 12. It's going to be a tough stretch for this Utah State team. And if they don't have things figured out by then, this Utah game is going to be tough for them as well. So not an easy stretch by all means for the Aggies coming into this game. But like I said, this can be a really challenging game for Utah, depending on the circumstances the week prior, depending on how Utah looks on the offensive line, defensive line. whatever may have you. Injuries could play a factor at that point. We'll see, right? It's 3 games into the season, last game in non-conference. These games, I don't want to say they don't matter. They do matter, but it's not conference play. So if there are wrinkles or things that you need worked out, you hope, if you're a Utah fan, that this is the game where everything kind of starts to become clear, right? As you get into that Iowa State game the next week, especially with that being your first road game of the season, you hope that any problems that you've had or things that are maybe minor or major can be cleaned up in this game, and you can kind of move forward into the next game the week later in a Big 12 setting. That is where things matter the most, right? Now, regardless of the situation, this is going to be a work in progress for Morgan Scalley and this team. There are a lot of questions, right? So this isn't a team coming in where there's a ton of veteran leadership. There is to an extent, but it's not like you're coming in and returning that offensive line that you had last year. There's going to be some challenges here. So with that, let's jump into Utah State. Let me quickly show this. We'll get back here. These are some stats from last year for Utah State. So you can see a lot of this in comparison to Utah. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see kind of how these work. If you're looking at the screen right now, the offense did enough, right? Like there was things, their run game wasn't great. A lot of that was partially due to their offensive line just not being able to hold up as well. Their run blocking was really poorly graded, much better in pass protection. But for the most part, this was an offense that could do enough to win games. But if you look at that defense, you don't even have to see the numbers. You just see a whole bunch of red. And quite honestly, this has been a Utah State theme for years and years and years. The defense hasn't always been effective. This is a 5-year trend that you're seeing on here. It's been tough. You are seeing Utah's red in the defense on that run defense, but for the most part, this is a team that is pretty solid in everything they do. So Utah State offense can be good, if not great at times, but on the defensive side, it's been a work in progress. And for Bronco Mendenhall being a defensive minded guy, that that's not something that he wants to live with, right? At the same time, you get who you get, and if you can't get players that are able to do it at a higher level, it's a tough ask, especially in the group of 6 right now. So interesting look there. Fascinating to kind of see how that works. But like I said, this is a team that can do well on offense. They can do things that can beat you, but defensively, they haven't done well enough to hold on. That was the case 2 years ago, right? Utah State did really well on offense, and when it came down to it, the defense let them down. They weren't able to get it done. Utah's offense obviously picked up and did better that second half, but by and large, it was the defense that kind of let them down. Tough look. All right, so looking at this, some of the coaching changes as we jump into this. Kevin McGivern obviously hired by Utah to be their new offensive coordinator. So anything that you've seen there offensively, there's going to be some similarities there, right? The skill set and the talent at Utah is just simply better. That's not like a hot take by any means. That's just the nature of it. And so there's going to be maybe better opportunities for Utah to maximize the offense that Kevin McGivern runs. With that said, it's still a new system for this team. They're still going through it. They're going to have to work through things and try to make it work. So, a lot of what you saw at Utah State is going to be similar to what you see at Utah with some different wrinkles, right? We've talked about this with the Rhinos being in play. Utah's going to go pretty heavy in a passing attack. They're going to try to do a lot of things to be able to open up the run game, which Utah State couldn't really maximize last year. So it's not a complete carbon copy of what they're doing, but at the same time, there's going to be a lot of familiarity there. There's going to be a lot of that stuff that takes place at Utah. So anything that you saw at Utah State is going to be pretty similar. It's kind of similar to how Jason Beck ran a lot of the stuff at New Mexico, right? And these two offenses are going to have similarities, and mostly in the names of what they or kind of the structure of how it is. They're going to be different, but it's based on the structure and what they're able to do. And so that's kind of that case. Because Kevin McGivern moved on to Utah, Bronco Mendenhall went back into his bag, a tried and true bag that has worked time and time again for Mendenhall, and he brought in Robert Anae to be his offensive coordinator. These two have worked 15 years together with Anae being an offensive coordinator. It's been longer than that in other capacities, but as an offensive coordinator, Robert Anae has been with Mendenhall for 15 years. So Anae took last year off. He was at North Carolina State for 2 years after they had spent some time at Virginia. and obviously BYU. So he wasn't coaching last year. He's coming back into this. Robert and I back coaching against Utah. So really curious to see anybody that is familiar with him and what he did at BYU in particular. You understand what that is. There's been some shifts a little bit. For the most part, it's going to be a similar system. He loves precision. Robert and I is very, very key on precision, meaning he wants efficiency and he wants execution. And so there's going to be a lot of things where you have to toe that line. And if you're not towing that line, you're not being effective in his offense. And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. It is a spread style offense, a lot of hurry up, no huddles, trying to use tempo, trying to control the clock, trying to do different things that way. Wants that physicality in the trenches, wants to be able to have a lot of work at the line of scrimmage with his receivers. And so there's a lot of, whether it be pick plays or a lot of things to kind of get you out of rhythm as a defense. That's what Robert and I is trying to do. And a lot of it really comes down to just that precision, trying to make it work, trying to get it all done and trying to get there. So familiar name, you don't have to go too far to be able to get in there and understand who Robert Anae is. Anybody that has been a Utah fan for a long time, especially when he was at BYU, understands who Robert Anae is. I don't feel like I have to go too crazy. I know there's a lot of newer Utah fans too, but just think spread system, physicality, trying to be able to maximize that tempo, that pace, trying to make that work. And in Utah's case, if that defensive line especially is not working, it's going to be tough. You do get Arkansas the week before, which is going to have a similar type of model where you're trying to use that pace. That's going to benefit Utah, where against Arkansas, you're going to see that for the first time this season. Then against Utah State, in theory, you should be in a better situation. If not, if Arkansas can exploit something similar to how Kansas State exploited something in Utah and then Kansas tried to do the same thing the week after, that's the case right here. Is if there's something wrong with Utah, especially whether it be, in the run game defense or whether it's, getting beat at the line of scrimmage in man-to-man situations, this is an opportunity where Utah State has a ton of film now to be able to go in and try to maximize that. And Robert and I is smart enough to be able to get there and do it. And so it becomes a real challenge for Utah if things aren't going well that way. So that, to me, out of everything on here, that's where this becomes the bigger challenge. Now, Utah State still has to have an effective quarterback, and we'll get into that. You've still got to have effective players that can do it for you. All of that is still factored in. But at the same time, if they can maximize on the strengths that they saw in the Arkansas game, assuming that there are strengths from Arkansas, and I'm not assuming that there shouldn't be, but if you can maximize those and see kind of a wrinkle in Utah's system, this is a place where they're going to maximize that. On the defensive side, there is no change there. You do bring back Nick Howell as your defensive coordinator. This is a coordinator that runs a 3-4 offense. Every once in a while, he'll slip into a 3-3-5 defense. And that's what, Iowa State is known for. That's what a lot of programs in the Big 12 have run over the years. And so it's something that's familiar to this coaching staff. It's not something that's going to catch them by surprise by any means. But at the same time, there's different things to kind of manipulate and kind of move it. And so you kind of have to be on your toes that way to understand what's going on. But Devin Dampier's, well versed in it. He's played in it. He understands it. So I don't know that there's anything in particular that is of concern in that regard. It's more just, Dampier and the rest of the players have to be on their P's and Q's, so to speak, to make sure that they can be effective against this team. But by and large, I think you've got a good situation going on where you have a good understanding of what those defensive schemes can be. From the transfer portal, Utah State obviously loses Braden Pagan, comes to Utah, their star wide receiver. Utah gets that opportunity to be able to utilize him now. And what does that bring? Different things in that regard. Junior Sia, offensive tackle for one of their better offensive tackles at Utah State. He transfers to BYU. He played 13 games for them with 731 snaps. That's a lot of experience to lose there. But this Utah State squad still returns a fair amount. Two other players that were kind of bigger names is Will Holmes, a defensive end. He moves to Illinois. 18 pressures, 31 tackles, 19 stops. Really solid player for them. So they're going to miss out on that. And then Noah Flores, a corner who transferred to Arkansas State, just had a ton of reps for the team. Gave up a lot in the passing game. So it's not a huge loss, but at the same time, it's experience, right? looking at the transfer portal, they bring in 32 players. They lost 20, bring in 32, trying to upgrade in a lot of these areas. Utah State does have a lot coming back, enough coming back, I should say, and now they're trying to get better here. The biggest name here, I would say, is McKay Helsted, the former BYU quarterback, who is actually the former Utah State quarterback. He comes back home to be able to try to be their starting quarterback. Did not have any passing stats last year. The last recorded stats were in 2023 at Utah State, where he threw for 1,062 yards, had 11 touchdowns, but had 8 interceptions at a 59.5% clip. So he had an effective season, but it was kind of a weird season for the Aggies. It just wasn't going well, and there was a lot of give and take with that quarterback situation. So there hasn't been a lot of consistency for McKay Hillstead. I think he's a solid player, little undersized, but I think he's a solid player that can do well for this team. And I think Bronco Mendenhall is probably the right coach to be able to get him to where he needs to be. But you're going to be limited, right? And I think we don't really fully know what's going on there. A couple other players. Javon Robinson is a wide receiver who committed from Georgia State. He comes in with 595 yards. He's going to be one that's going to be a focal point. Outside of that, of these transfer players, a lot of them that just don't have a ton of experience. That doesn't mean they don't have a ton of upside or couldn't be potential starters this year. It's just there hasn't been a lot of stats or a lot of production over the last few years. And so it's kind of hard to measure what they're going to be. I think there's a lot of talent, but it's hard to know what's taking place. For example, you have a guy from coming in from Virginia, from Oklahoma State, from Cal, from Virginia Tech, Wyoming, New Mexico State, that should factor into this team, but it's hard to know kind of what that's going to be. Some of the big names that graduated this last year, Bryson Barnes, obviously, he's now doing it at the professional level, not at the NFL, but he's doing it at the professional level. You also have Miles Davis, their running back, who rushed for 731 yards. He and Barnes combined actually for 1,400 yards rushing and 18 touchdowns. So that's a lot to miss. They're going to have to kind of make up for that. You also have Brady Boyd, who's a wide receiver, had 743 yards just behind Braden Pagan. Both of these guys put up a lot of numbers. Now you don't have those top two. You also lose 2 of your top safeties in Noah Avenger and then Ike Larson. And then you lose a linebacker, John Miller. He was their leading linebacker there. So you got that. Looking at who's coming in, you've got McKay Hillstead as your quarterback, right? I think that's the expectation. I don't see a world where it's somebody else, but crazier things have happened. But he's a guy that, from the high school ranks on, was a solid player, just kind of got thrown into it a little early, was kind of forced to. But, I think he's got the right mindset and ability and talent to be able to lead Utah State. It's just going to be a question of kind of, can they get what they need to done with Hillstead. At running back, there's kind of I wouldn't even call it a three-way rate. There's 2 running backs, I'll list all 3. Javon Jacobs, a running back. He's a senior, stays from the program. He was the 3rd leading rusher. He had 429 yards last year, 5 touchdowns. He also contributed in the pass or the receiving game with 379 yards. Should be kind of the lead back. But you also have Noah White, who returns as their 4th leading rusher with 93 yards. And then you bring in Oklahoma State's Sesi Vialahi. He comes in with 152 yards and 2 touchdowns. So a good stable of running backs. We'll see who can kind of emerge, but you do have the senior Javon Jacobs, who should be pretty solid there. As I said, he also factors into the receiving game, so you can be there. As receivers, though, Javon Robinson, that Georgia State wide receiver, I'm assuming is going to be your star. He's going to be the focal point. And then you bring in a couple other, a little bit more unproven guys in Rex Hayes from Arizona, Eli Wood from Oklahoma State. And then the rest of it's a lot of youth. So there's going to be a lot of growing and maturing in this. Offensive line, you do bring back 3 starters. You got your 2 guards and you got your center. For the most part, solid players, much better in pass blocking than they were in run blocking. It's a group that needs to mature and grow, right? Develop together. I think last year is going to go a long way for them to be able to make sure you get there. But the fact that you have your 3 inside linemen that are returning does well for you. Now you just got to make sure you get those outside, those tackles that can do well for you, which likely could be John Randall Jr. from Purdue. or Chewy Wade from Oklahoma State. These are guys that just haven't had a ton of production, though. And so it's going to be a question on who comes out in that offensive line in the tackles room. Defensively, they do have, veteran leaders in every position group on that roster. Brevin Hamblin, a senior safety that had a ton of snaps, did a lot for this team. I think, is going to add a lot of consistency there. You do have two linebackers in Bronson Oliveo and Chris Joe, who got a lot of snaps, had a lot of experience. That's going to go a long way for you. You also have Carson Tujay and Tyree Morris on the line that are going to give you a lot of snaps on the experience on the inside. They're veteran leaders that are going to be able to help you, and I think that's going to help. So with that said, that's kind of where this team is at. I don't want to go too crazy in all these things, go too deep, because we do have another team to talk about. But for the most part, this is a team that has pieces, right? They have enough pieces there to be able to compete. I just don't know that they have star end talent, especially on the offensive side of the ball yet, that is the biggest difference maker. With that said, that's not to say that they don't have players that can do it. It's just a lot of it is a little bit more unproven. Defensively, you have a lot more consistency in terms of who is coming back, and at least having guys that have been in the program, understand the model, understand what's going on. But at the same time, that defense didn't do enough last year, right? And so they have to take that step forward. And if they can't, it doesn't really, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but you're not really making those strides that you need to. So we'll see what's up. To me, the biggest questions for this team is the defense, right? Trying to figure out how that defense can get better. Then who emerges at wide receiver? Who are the guys that McKay Hillstead can throw to? Can they all be effective together? Can they create a complementary set of players to be able to create an offense that works in a new system under Robert Anae? There's enough that Robert Anae does that they can go pretty easy early on, especially with a lot of that work at the line of scrimmage in the receiving game, doing that to utilize a lot of space to be able to open up, lanes for their run. There's a lot here that Utah State can do that you don't have to be fully prepared and ready from day one. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot that needs to improve. And so with that, it's just kind of the glow up from last year, right? Trying to be able to improve on the things that you were successful on, as well as improving on the things that you struggled with, namely defense. So there's that. All right, let's jump over to Utah's next opponent, and this is the first game of Big 12 play, and that is the Iowa State Cyclones. This is Utah State's first road game of the season, so they get 3 home games to open up the season, which can benefit this team, especially as they have a lot of different questions coming into the year on kind of improving. That allows them to be able to grow and develop in theory. But then you go on the road to Iowa State, which isn't the easiest place to get to, but at the same time, this team charters flights into anywhere, so it's not too complicated like some other programs within the university. Iowa State comes into this having played Iowa and then Bowling Green in the prior 2 weeks. So they do get Iowa, their rival, and then you have Bowling Green as the kind of the off moment before coming and facing Utah. Iowa State, it's hard to kind of predict what's going to go or what's going to happen with this Iowa State team simply because they lost everybody. But last year they finished 8-4, 5-4 in Big 12 play. The last time these two teams played, Iowa State won. It didn't go well for Utah. It was a 31-28 loss. That was that 2024 season that we talked about. So that was not a great year for Utah. Obviously, we're better in that game, but that Iowa State defense was pretty stacked that year, and there's not much Utah could do. As I mentioned, the projected win total here is 5.5 games. If you believe a lot of the metrics or the predicting models out there, Iowa State is picked to finish last in the conference this year, and I'll get into why that is the case. So after this game, Utah does get their one and only bye of the season. So you do get 4 games to be able to get into the year, have a lot of opportunities available to you on the back half of that, but it does come early enough that, that could spell trouble later on in the year if things aren't going well and you kind of need that break. So you do get, like I said, you get the 3 non-conference games. You do get a Big 12 game under your belt before you get that bye. And then it's smooth sailing the rest of the way, right? We'll see. All right. Last year, looking at this, even though I don't know that there's much to look back on for last year or why it really matters here, I'll even pull up the stats as I talk about this. With that said, it really doesn't matter because this is a completely new team. But last year, they were fairly decent on offense, not great, but not terrible. Defense was better. This is an Iowa State team that has taken pride in a defense. Like I said, they run that 3-3-5 defense it kind of revolutionized college football for a hot minute, gave people different looks that were confusing. But at the end of the day, it started to pick up, and a lot of people were getting used to it and familiar with it. And so it kind of, I don't want to say it lost its luster. It's just more, once you learned how to beat it, it was not even that it was easy to beat, but you could figure out ways, right? It was just, you saw something new. And so that's kind of what Iowa State is used to over the last, I think, decade. So there's going to be a change that way, and I'll get into that here shortly. But this is a team that's a completely different team. Matt Campbell, head coach of 10 years, he decides, let me take that up. He decides to take the Penn State job. And, a lot of people felt like this was a year too late. He could have gotten jobs elsewhere after their first 10-win season ever in program history, but decided to jump this last year. And with him, he brings his star quarterback in Rocco Becht and every other player, right? Let me go through, let's see. Sorry, I got to scroll down on my notes here. They had 55 players enter the portal. 23 of those players followed him to Penn State. Another 11 went to different Big Ten schools, and then another 3 went to either the ACC, Big 12, or the SEC. So there was a lot of talent on this team. They could do a lot with it, and they were valuable elsewhere. But at the same time, a majority of that roster left to Penn State, and that's all your starters. You don't have any returning starters. You don't have anybody coming back in that regard. And so this is a completely brand new team. There's nothing about this team. There's a few holdovers, guys that were depth players, that kind of stuff, that had some contributing. But for the most part, this is a completely brand new team with a completely new coaching staff and a completely new roster. And so that's where a lot of the intrigue comes in, is because there's going to be a lot of unknowns. Anything that you saw last year, throw that out the window, right? You can look at the stats, you can look at the trends, the 5-year trends. None of that really matters because this is a completely new staff. So who do they go to? They go to Jimmy Rogers to replace Matt Campbell as the head coach. He comes in from Washington State after one season, only at Washington State for one season. Tough break for Washington Cougars. They've gone through it the last few years, and they lose their coach. Prior to that, after his 1 year at Washington State, he was the head coach at South Dakota State for 2 years after serving as the defensive coordinator there. So coming up from the FCS worlds, and don't get me wrong, those are phenomenal FCS teams, or a team, but he's coming in for the first time to the FBS level at Washington State. He does good enough there at Washington State to then get this job at Iowa State, but there's still a lot of youth or inexperience on his side in terms of that FBS experience, right? FCS and being a top tier team there, it means something, but at the same time, it's just a different level of competition. And so I don't think you're going to see, a 1-year rise, right? Like I think it's going to take some time. I think they feel confident with who they have. And I really think that Jimmy Rogers could be a star, but we just don't know. There's a lot of unknowns, and you can argue that's Morgan Scalley, right? He's never had a head coaching job, but he's been with the program for years. He's coached it. He understands it. He's recruited to it. There's a little bit of a difference there. So we'll see. He brings in with him his offensive coordinator in Tyler Roll. Tyler Roll, he was previously the tight ends coach at the Detroit Lions last year. His only stint as an offensive coordinator was at North Dakota State, another FCS power, from 2019 to 2023. This is his first OC job in the FBS. And so there's going to be a lot of newness for him as well, trying to be able to do this at this level. He was previously at Iowa State in 2024 as an assistant head coach and running backs coach. So he has some of that experience, but it's still not, I don't know that it's enough yet to get a good read on if he can be an effective offensive play caller in the power level, right? We'll see. His offensive scheme is more pro style offense. And when I say pro style, think more Andy Ludwig. This is kind of Andy Ludwig's model of how he wants to run. A lot of physicality, wants to use multiple tight ends, whether it be 12 personnel, 13 personnel, wants to get fullbacks involved, wants to have plays under center a lot. Maybe Ludwig didn't do that a ton, but you have that. And then there's a lot of play action plays that are designed to kind of set up that run. So everything is meant to kind of be this run heavy game. You go from the Utah State and the Arkansas State, or Arkansas, not Arkansas State game, where it's much more spread and open and trying to be able to be fast and quick. This is much more pro style, trying to get into, the run game. Quite honestly, this is an offense that Utah knows well. Granted, I would say the coaching staff knows well because they've been on that roster for a while. Some of the players are brand new, so they may not. But at the same time, this is a well-known offense that Utah has seen for years and years and years, and so there's a lot of experience there. On defense, they bring in Jesse Bobbitt as the defensive coordinator. He comes with Rogers from Washington State. He was there with him for a year. Like I said, this is a shift from the 3-3-5 that was made popular at Iowa State now to something completely different. His scheme is much more 4-3 or even a 4-2-5. 4-2-5 is probably more what he'll run at times. He wants to limit explosive plays in what he calls a rule-based and sound defense. He wants to be multiple on defense, just meaning they can be flexible, do a lot of different things, have a lot more flexibility with his linebackers, and then a lot more man coverage in his secondary. So a lot of, this is a Utah team in a lot of respects, right? There's going to be a lot of similarities in how they run on defense, a lot of similarities in how they run on offense, at least the past offense. And so you're kind of looking Utah in the mirror in some respects. Not completely, and obviously this team has changed, but that's kind of what it's going to be. Looking at Bobbitt, his defensive coordinator or his defensive schemes and what he was able to do at Washington State last year in 1 year, he only allowed 20.2 points per game, which was 26th in the country. He only allowed 125.2 yards per game, 33rd in the country. 174.4 yards in the country in passing, 13th in the country. And in total defense, 299.5 yards, 15th in the country. Well, you might be saying to yourself, well, they didn't really play anybody that was of merit, right? Washington State really didn't play anybody. No, they played some really tough teams in North Texas, Washington, number 4 Ole Miss, number 18 Virginia, number 21 James Madison. And outside of 2 games, North Texas, they allowed 410 yards in a 59-10 blowout. That was crazy. Ole Miss, they only lost by 3 and they allowed 439 yards. Only lost by 2 to Virginia, allowed 300 yards, and lost by 4 to James Madison, only allowed 319 yards. So this is a defensive coordinator that can do really well. The question's going to be, can he get that quickly with a roster that is completely brand new? Washington State, they did have, an influx of talent coming in from the portal, but it's unknown kind of what this roster for Iowa State's going to be. There's just so many new faces. Everybody's new. Everybody has never had time together outside of now in spring. It's going to be different. Like I said, 55 players transferred out, 48 came in. The biggest names there, and I can't run through all of them because there's just going to be so many, and literally every transfer portal guy is most likely, well, not every, but they're going to the transfer portal to try to find starters. So every starter is probably going to come from the transfer portal outside of maybe a few that stayed that were depth players. For the most part, every single player in that transfer portal pool is likely going to be in that starter caliber player. Not starter caliber. You get what I'm saying. There's a lot of players. 2 to highlight here is the quarterbacks, Zane Flores from Oklahoma State, and then Jalen Rayner from Arkansas State. 2 solid QBs that are going to be battling it out, though Jalen Rayner is likely going to be your starter. He comes into Iowa State having thrown 3,300 yards last year, 19 touchdowns. He did throw 11 interceptions, but he did it at a 66.5% completion rate. So he is turnover prone, but he does complete a lot of his passes. Also rushed for 423 yards and 7 touchdowns. They weren't huge numbers based on the number of carries that he had. Like, he only averaged 2.8 yards per carry, but still effective in what he was able to do. Barring some change, I think Rayner is going to be your guy. Flores is young. He's a sophomore this year. He got thrown into the mix last year at Oklahoma State in a toxic, terrible situation. Threw for 1,400, almost 1,500 yards, but had way more interceptions than he did touchdowns, 7-3. There's a lot about his game that he needs to clean up. In theory, he'll be in a better situation, but I think you're going to see him as the backup to Jalen Rayner. Just going through some of these players that may be impactful players for the team. At running back, you got Cameron Petaway. He comes in from Bowling Green. He was named the MAC Freshman of the Year. Now, if you look at his stats, they don't necessarily jump off the page. He only, in his freshman season, rushed for 365 yards, didn't have a touchdown in 9 games, but he also returned 395 yards in kick returns. In total, he had like 900 all-purpose yards. And so there's a lot about his game that gives people a lot of hope that he can be kind of the star. So he hasn't popped off the page yet, at least in just rushing, but he's a complete player that can do a lot, and that's why he was named the MAC Freshman of the Year. So he's likely to be there, and then his backup will be Saladin Allah from Oregon State, who had 71 yards last year. Good B type running back, your backup guy, but for the most part, Cameron Petaway will be your guy. And then at receiver, you're likely going to see these 3 as your starters. You got Cody Jackson, who will likely be your ex-receiver from Tarleton State. He had 799 yards last year and 6 touchdowns. In your Z receiver, you'll probably get Carter Pabst from Washington State. So he comes over with the coaching staff. Only had 168 yards last year. We'll see, but he's going to probably be the guy that they tab. And then in your slot, transfer from Tulane is Amari Hayes. He had 515 yards and 1 touchdown last year. So those are going to be your guys most likely. On the defensive line, you do bring in 3 guys from Washington State, 3 starter caliber guys from Washington State. So really good opportunity there to be able to bring that consistency, especially with the defensive coordinator and having that. The star of the defense coming in here is likely going to be Isaac Terrell. He's a defensive end, junior, really solid numbers in Pro Football Focus in his offense or his defensive grade, as well as his pass rush. 23 hurries, 9 sacks, 22 stops, and 1 touchdown, and should be able to contribute well that way. So to me, those are kind of the players to know. But at the same time, at Iowa State, this is going to be completely unknown to anybody, even at Iowa State, because I just don't know that they have a full handle of what's going on there. So the biggest questions here is, one, just the turnover, right? Trying to bring in 50-ish players to try to make a roster in one season, it generally doesn't go well. You've seen that with other programs around the country. I just don't know that it's going to be an immediate hit. On top of that, you have a younger coaching staff that does have experience, but not necessarily at the FBS level, or guys that haven't coached in their respective roles for very long at all. And so there's just going to be a lot of unknowns that way. I think what they have at Jimmy Rogers is going to be really solid as a head coach, but it's just unknown what it's going to look like or how it's going to manifest itself in the FBS level at a power conference program, right? And in your first year where you've got that much turnover, it's just going to be a challenge. And so while this game can be tough for Utah, especially that defensive side, Iowa State's still going to hone in on that defense. I think that's still going to be a major tenet of this program. So Iowa State fans who have always loved their defense, you're still going to get that. I think the real question just comes down to what can they do on offense, and can they do enough this year to make it work? On top of that, it's just putting all those pieces together at a university that is kind of scrambling for resources. It's been a tough situation. So we'll see what happens. I honestly don't know what this team is going to look like. Getting them in week 4 is good in the sense that you have 3 games prior to see what they've done. You do get them against a rival in Iowa, which Iowa's going to be clearly better on paper, but that game is always chaotic and you never know what's going to happen. But at the same time, I think you're going to see a lot of unknowns with this team and trying to understand what's happening with Iowa State. So with that, those are our next 2 games. We'll then move forward to our next 2 games of the series next week. We're going to bypass the bye, so I'm not going to count the bye as one of those teams, but that's what it's going to be. So we've got the two teams coming up next week for Utah, and we'll continue on this series. We'll give you updates on the official visits. We'll give you updates on the Big 12 spring meetings and kind of go from there. But for the podcast, for myself, we will sign out and talk to you later. Have a great day.